Flight 728 sailed smoothly through the afternoon sky, cruising at 30,000 feet above a blanket of brilliant white clouds. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere felt almost peaceful. Parents chatted quietly while children pressed their faces against the windows, searching for shapes in the endless sea below. A businessman closed his laptop with a satisfied smile. An elderly couple shared headphones, listening to their favorite songs together. Flight attendants moved gracefully through the aisle, offering drinks, collecting empty cups, and reassuring nervous first-time travelers with practiced warmth. Everything felt routine, predictable, and wonderfully ordinary. Near the middle of the cabin, an 11-year-old girl sat beside her grandmother, quietly watching the wing outside instead of the movie playing on the seatback screen. Resting on her lap was a small notebook covered with hand-drawn airplanes. Every few moments she glanced toward the cockpit door, thoughtful but relaxed, as though listening for something no one else could hear. Without warning, the cabin lights flickered. Conversations paused. The entertainment screens blinked black before returning a second later. A nervous laugh drifted through the cabin as passengers exchanged uncertain smiles, assuming the interruption was nothing more than harmless turbulence. Then the intercom crackled. Static hissed through the speakers. Silence followed. The engines continued their steady roar, yet an invisible weight settled over the aircraft. Flight attendants stopped where they stood, exchanging confused glances. One reached for the cabin phone, but no answer came from the cockpit. At last, the speakers burst to life again. The captain's voice trembled with unmistakable fear. "Something is terribly wrong." The transmission ended abruptly. No explanation, no reassurance, only silence. A wave of panic swept through the cabin. Parents clutched their children. Passengers looked desperately toward the front of the aircraft, searching for answers that never came. Amid the growing fear, only the quiet 11-year-old remained perfectly still. She slowly lifted her eyes toward the cockpit door. There was no panic on her face, only quiet focus, and somehow, that frightened everyone even more. While frightened whispers spread from row to row, the little girl remained seated beside her grandmother, her hands resting quietly on a weathered notebook. The faded cover had softened from years of use, and inside were carefully drawn sketches of airplanes, cockpit layouts, and handwritten notes that looked surprisingly detailed for someone her age. Most passengers who noticed her simply smiled, assuming she was another child fascinated by airplanes. No one imagined there was anything unusual about the quiet girl in the window seat. Her name was Mia, and she had always preferred observing instead of speaking. While other children collected toys, she collected facts about aircraft. She knew the shapes of different wings, the sounds of various engines, and the purpose of instruments most adults had never heard of. Yet she never showed off what she knew. Learning had always been something personal, something she quietly shared with only one person, her father. Before illness took him away 3 years earlier, every evening ended the same way. They would spread books across the kitchen table, sketch airplanes together, and imagine flights across distant skies. He never treated those lessons like schoolwork. To him, they were adventures, moments where curiosity mattered more than perfection. Whenever Mia became frustrated by something difficult, he would smile, close the book, and gently remind her, "When everyone else panics, slow your breathing first." Those words had stayed with her long after his voice was gone. Now, as fear slowly tightened its grip on the cabin, Mia instinctively drew one slow breath, then another. Her fingers lightly touched the notebook, as though it carried a piece of her father with it. Around her, worried passengers searched each other's faces for reassurance. Flight attendants whispered urgently near the galley, trying to hide their concern. Even her grandmother squeezed Mia's hand a little tighter, unaware that the child beside her was quietly recalling lessons that suddenly felt frighteningly important. Then a sharp cry echoed from the front of the cabin, followed by hurried footsteps rushing toward the cockpit, and the uneasy silence shattered into unmistakable chaos. The sharp cry sent every head turning toward the front of the aircraft. One flight attendant hurried through the cockpit door, while another tried to calm the rising panic, forcing a reassuring smile that fooled no one. Seconds stretched into an eternity before the first attendant stumbled back into the aisle, her face drained of color. She leaned close to her colleague and whispered something that instantly erased every trace of composure. The terrible truth spread without a single announcement. Something had happened inside the cockpit. Moments later, the lead flight attendant picked up the intercom, but only bursts of static answered her trembling voice. She tried again, adjusting switches and pressing buttons. Yet the communication system crackled with broken fragments before falling silent once more. The cabin grew unbearably quiet except for frightened whispers and the steady roar of the engines carrying them through an endless sky. Inside the cockpit, the captain remained unconscious despite desperate attempts to wake him. The CO pilot briefly opened his eyes, struggling to focus as he reached weakly toward the controls. His lips moved with painful effort. "I can't," he whispered before collapsing back into his seat, too disoriented to continue. The flight attendant stared helplessly, realizing she could not manage the cockpit alone. Returning to the cabin, she made the announcement no passenger ever expected to hear. "If anyone on board has professional aviation experience, please identify yourself immediately." Silence followed. Then a gray-haired man slowly stood from seat 18C. Introducing himself as a retired helicopter pilot, he volunteered without hesitation. Hope flickered across anxious faces as he hurried forward. Yet only minutes after entering the cockpit, he emerged again, his expression heavier than before. "I can assist," he admitted quietly, "but I've never flown an aircraft like this. I can't do it alone." The words landed harder than the announcement itself. Fear swept through the cabin. Some passengers prayed, others cried openly. Parents wrapped trembling arms around their children. Amid the chaos, a small voice broke through. "I think I can help." Heads turned toward Mia. Several passengers exchanged bewildered looks. One man shook his head in disbelief, assuming she misunderstood the situation. Even her grandmother stared at her, speechless. The retired pilot knelt beside the girl instead of dismissing her. Calmly, he pointed toward a safety magazine illustration showing a cockpit panel and asked her to identify several instruments. Without hesitation, Mia named each one correctly and explained its basic purpose from memory. For the first time since the emergency began, the retired pilot's skeptical expression gave way to cautious hope. The retired pilot looked into Mia's steady eyes for a long moment before making the hardest decision of his life. He nodded once, then gently guided her toward the cockpit. Every frightened passenger watched in stunned silence as the smallest person on board walked down the aisle with quiet determination. No one spoke. The only sounds were hurried footsteps and the constant hum of the engines. Crossing the cockpit doorway, Mia paused. It looked nothing like the simple sketches in her notebook. Panels filled with switches, glowing displays, and warning lights surrounded the pilot's seats. For a brief second, the sheer complexity threatened to overwhelm her. She closed her eyes. One slow breath, then another. "When everyone else panics, slow your breathing first." Her father's voice echoed in her memory, and the fear began to settle. Instead of reaching for the controls, Mia carefully studied every instrument. She compared what she saw with the mental checklists she had practiced hundreds of times at the kitchen table. The retired helicopter pilot watched closely as she quietly identified the primary flight display, navigation display, engine instruments, radio panel, and autopilot controls. She wasn't rushing. She was making sure every observation matched what she had learned. The helicopter pilot handled the controls he understood while Mia pointed out the systems her father had spent years explaining. Together they slowly built a picture of what the aircraft was doing and what still appeared to be functioning normally. At last, the radio crackled with a distant voice. "Flight 728. Respond immediately." The helicopter pilot answered, explaining the emergency as calmly as possible. The controller's questions came rapidly, but hesitation filled the conversation when he mentioned that an 11-year-old girl was assisting him. There was a long silence. Then the controller asked Mia a direct question about the aircraft's navigation display and autopilot status. Without hesitation, she answered using clear aviation terminology, describing exactly what she was seeing without exaggeration or uncertainty. The controller asked another, then another. Each answer came calmly. Each response made perfect sense. The disbelief inside the control tower slowly gave way to cautious respect. She was not pretending. She was not repeating random facts. She genuinely understood the systems in front of her. For the first time since the emergency began, hope returned. Not because anyone believed a child could perform a miracle, but because everyone realized she might know just enough to help the adults fight for every life on board. Outside the cockpit windows, dark clouds gathered ahead, and the most dangerous part of the journey was still waiting. Rain hammered against the windshield as Flight 728 emerged from the clouds. What had once been clear skies had transformed into a wall of dark weather, with powerful crosswinds pushing relentlessly against the aircraft. Every warning light seemed brighter now, every sound inside the cockpit carrying a new sense of urgency. Fuel numbers continued to fall, leaving little room for hesitation or mistakes. The controller's calm voice returned over the radio, guiding the retired helicopter pilot one instruction at a time. He followed each direction with remarkable discipline, admitting whenever something fell outside his experience. Pride no longer mattered. Saving lives did. Mia remained focused on the instruments in front of her. She wasn't trying to replace the pilot beside her. Instead, she watched every display carefully, calling out changes in altitude, speed, and heading exactly as her father had taught her during countless evenings of practice. Whenever uncertainty appeared, she paused, checked again, and spoke only when she was certain. Outside the cabin, passengers sensed the aircraft descending. Oxygen masks remained hidden, but fear hung heavily in the air. Some people held hands with complete strangers. Others bowed their heads in silent prayer. Parents whispered comforting promises to frightened children, even though they weren't sure they believed those promises themselves. The runway finally appeared through a break in the rain, stretching ahead like a narrow ribbon of hope. Relief lasted only a heartbeat before another gust of wind shoved the aircraft sideways. Warning alarms sounded inside the cockpit. The helicopter pilot tightened his grip on the controls while Mia calmly reported every movement she saw on the flight display, helping him recognize each correction before the aircraft drifted too far. "Stay with it," the controller encouraged. "You're lined up. Small corrections only." The runway grew larger. 500 feet. 400. 300. No one breathed. The aircraft rocked violently one final time before leveling just enough to continue the approach. The landing gear met the runway with a thunderous impact that echoed through the cabin. Tires screamed against the pavement as the aircraft bounced once, before settling firmly onto the ground. Reverse thrust slowed the aircraft while everyone waited, terrified that it might veer off course. It didn't. Flight 728 rolled steadily down the runway until it finally came to a complete stop. For several long seconds, absolute silence filled the cabin. There was no applause, no cheering, only the quiet sound of people crying. Some hugged loved ones. Others covered their faces with trembling hands, overwhelmed by the realization that they were still alive. In the cockpit, the retired pilot looked at Mia with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. One question lingered in every mind, impossible to ignore. Who had taught an 11-year-old child to remain so calm when even seasoned adults had nearly lost hope? The answer would soon change everything. In the hours that followed, emergency crews surrounded Flight 728, while investigators quietly began asking questions. They expected complicated explanations about cockpit procedures, radio communications, and split-second decisions. Instead, they found themselves sitting across from an 11-year-old girl who answered every question with remarkable honesty. Mia never claimed she had landed the airplane alone. She explained that the retired helicopter pilot had flown the aircraft, while the controllers guided them safely from the ground. She had only shared the knowledge she possessed, and stayed calm when others needed her to. Every answer reflected humility rather than pride. When an investigator asked where she had learned so much about aviation, Mia carefully placed her worn notebook on the table. Inside were years of handwritten notes, neatly labeled diagrams, weather charts, radio procedures, and simple explanations of complex systems. Tucked between the pages were small family photographs and faded pieces of paper covered with careful corrections written in another hand. Her father's. Before becoming ill, he had spent years as a respected flight instructor. He believed children understood far more than most adults realized, if someone took the time to teach them with patience instead of doubt. Every evening, he transformed their kitchen into a classroom filled with curiosity rather than pressure. He never expected Mia to face an emergency in the sky. He simply wanted to share the wonder of flight with the daughter he loved more than anything. After he passed away, Mia couldn't bear to close the notebook. So she kept studying, not because she dreamed of becoming famous, not because she wanted recognition. She studied because every lesson made her feel as though she was spending one more evening beside her father, hearing his gentle encouragement and quiet laughter. The room fell silent as the investigators turned each worn page. They no longer saw a remarkable child alone. They saw the enduring gift of a father whose greatest lesson had never been about airplanes. It had been about staying calm, thinking clearly, and helping others when fear threatened to take control. In that moment, everyone understood the truth. This story had never been about an 11-year-old who knew extraordinary things. It had always been about the extraordinary power of love, preparation, and the lasting influence of someone who believed that even the smallest student could one day make a life-changing difference. By sunrise, that remarkable story was already beginning to travel far beyond the airport. Within days, the story of Flight 728 had reached every corner of the country. News reports praised the remarkable teamwork that had saved 176 lives, but one name appeared in every headline: Mia. Cameras followed her wherever she went, yet she remained the same quiet girl who preferred listening over speaking. Whenever reporters called her a hero, she gently shook her head and reminded them that no one had survived alone. At a gathering organized for the passengers and crew, emotions filled the room long before anyone stepped to the microphone. Families embraced one another as though meeting for the first time again. One after another, passengers thanked Mia for giving them hope during the darkest moments of their lives. Many admitted that simply seeing her calm expression had stopped them from giving in to panic. When the retired helicopter pilot finally spoke, the room fell silent. "I've flown helicopters for decades," he said. "Experience helped me keep my hands steady, but knowledge alone wasn't enough that day. Mia saw things I couldn't. Without her calm mind and everything she had learned, I honestly don't believe I could have brought that airplane home safely." His words carried more weight than any headline ever could. Aviation professionals later praised Mia not as a miracle worker, but as an extraordinary example of preparation, composure, humility, and teamwork under unimaginable pressure. They emphasized that every person involved, from the cabin crew and air traffic controllers to the retired pilot and the young girl, had played an essential role in the outcome. Months later, Mia quietly donated her father's weathered notebook to an aviation museum. Rather than placing it beside famous aircraft, the museum created a small exhibit dedicated to the importance of learning, courage, and the lasting influence of a great teacher. Visitors often stopped longest at that simple notebook, discovering that the greatest legacy was never measured by medals or records, but by the lives forever changed through knowledge shared with love. One final chapter of Mia's journey was still waiting to be written. 6 months later, the morning sun bathed the small airfield in a warm golden light as Mia walked toward a modest training aircraft with a quiet confidence that hadn't existed before Flight 728. She wore no medals, accepted no special treatment, and asked for no attention. To everyone there, she was simply another student beginning her first official flying lesson. Before climbing into the cockpit, she carefully opened her flight bag. Beside a brand-new training manual, she placed the weathered notebook her father had filled with lessons, sketches, and words of encouragement. Its pages were worn from years of careful reading, yet they remained her greatest source of inspiration. She gently rested her hand on its cover, smiled to herself, and whispered a silent thank you. As the instructor completed the pre-flight inspection, Mia looked toward the endless blue sky stretching above the runway. This time she wasn't looking for answers during an emergency. She was looking toward the future her father had always believed she could build. Some people become heroes in a single unforgettable moment. But the truth is, those moments are usually shaped by countless quiet days of learning, patience, love, and preparation that no one else ever sees. And sometimes, the smallest passenger on the airplane carries the greatest lesson of all.